Continuing now with the notes for Chapter 8, and in this portion of the video, we're going to take a look at television and video programming. First off, let's talk about network affiliates. This is one of the main types of television stations that you are going to encounter. And these are the folks that align themselves with one of the big networks, CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, some of the different netlets that are out there. What network affiliates do is that they enter into contractual agreements with a network for access to programming. Now, what has happened traditionally is that networks were paying their affiliates network compensation for the stations to be able to basically earn some revenue by airing the programming of the network, and the network recoups its money by selling advertising on a national level. These days, though, programming costs have become such that, the networks are having issues keeping afloat, to be quite honest. Audiences continue to fragment, so there's not as strong of a draw as we see the decline of watching broadcast television as broadcast television. So in all but the top markets, this network compensation has pretty much been eliminated. And in a few cases, affiliates will enter long-term agreements with networks in which the affiliates wind up paying the network. And this is a practice called reverse compensation. So we're seeing here kind of a fundamental shift in the way that networks have basically worked with their various local affiliates in a shift of who is paying whom. So we can see that this obviously is going to be a problem for many local affiliates. And this also kind of explains how many different local affiliates are now looking towards receiving additional revenue, not from the network, but from various cable and satellite outlets that pay the local channels retransmission fees. Some networks negotiate with affiliates to give back local advertising time to the networks in exchange for compensation as well. So perhaps instead of getting local avails within network programming, the network retains more of that commercial avail time. Now, the other type of station, the main one that would be out there, are independent stations. They are not affiliated with a broadcast network. They generate the bulk of their schedule through syndication, barter, and local production. And this tends to happen primarily in news when it comes to local content that's being produced. Some stations will also produce local talk shows. Some stations also have local game shows that they will create, or various types of lifestyle types of programming and that sort of thing. Very few, if any, local stations will produce their own sitcoms or dramas or things of that nature. Some stations will also produce local sports programming for various types of minor league baseball or football or soccer and those sorts of things. That's another local programming avenue that you may see that's created by a particular television station. Some of the sources for independent programmers. This would also be sources of programming for networks that are trying to fill the time that they have available that the networks do not fill. So you can lump them in there as well. There's first-run syndication. This involves programs offered directly to local television stations, thus bypassing the national broadcast networks. So these would be shows that are brand new, that are being seen for the first time, but they are not shown on a particular network. They are offered direct to local broadcast stations. Off-network syndication represents those series that have had a previous run on a network schedule. So shows that did originally show up on CBS or ABC or Fox or what have you, that now find themselves running in a syndicated format that local stations are running at various times outside of prime time. Now, ideally, a show would have a minimum of somewhere around 100 episodes to 150 episodes before entering the syndication marketplace. This allows a local station to run the series on a strip basis, and what we mean by that is that the show is able to run 5 days a week at a particular time with a minimum of 2 runs per year. So what that means is that if you have, for example, 100 episodes that you're able to run, and you can run each episode twice, that should get you through the majority of a broadcast year once you account in things like special broadcasts for one reason or another that may preempt that programming. Also, very popular in off-network syndication, sitcoms. This is where you see the revivals of things like The Big Bang Theory and Seinfeld and Friends and some of the other timeless former network situation comedies. Also, you will find that on cable channels, they tend to pick up the off-network syndicated dramas. It's where you see various incarnations of old episodes of NCIS and CSI and Criminal Minds and all of those types of programs. Reality programs, they don't usually fare well in syndication, largely because a lot of reality programming tends to be more in the moment, and they just don't do well in being rerun in the sort of ways that we would expect sitcoms and dramas to be rerun. Programming of interest to a state or a region may be produced as part of an ad hoc network, and an ad hoc network will consist of stations that affiliate together in order to receive certain types of programming. This would be various types of news or information programming that perhaps is of interest to a particular state. So if you had a show that focused on North Carolina newsmakers, for example, that's something that several stations within North Carolina may band together and create this ad hoc network to be able to show. Various types of regional sports would also fit within this sort of idea. So things that wouldn't necessarily be of interest nationally, but would be of interest throughout a state or throughout a certain region of the country. Ad hoc networks are very useful for distributing that type of programming. Some original programs on the web and on various digital platforms. More original programming is being developed for streaming via digital platforms as an alternative to traditional television networks and stations. These would be those programs that bill themselves as Netflix originals or Hulu originals, for example. They never spent any time on traditional television, whether it be broadcast or cable. They go straight to the streaming services. Former network series can also be found via digital platforms, and these would be shows that are canceled by networks, but they can be picked up by streaming services. A good example of this recently has been the show All Rise, which was canceled by CBS, but then was picked up by one of the streaming services. The growth of online video has led many consumers to cancel subscriptions to multi-channel services, a practice known as cord cutting. Many supplement their streaming service with getting broadcast TV via an antenna. So for those that have certain particular tastes, they may decide that they're going to subscribe to one or a handful of various streaming platforms to be able to watch various types of content. And then they may or may not combine that with use of an antenna for broadcast TV, and that would replace their cable or satellite subscription. Local broadcast programming. Most local programming consists of news, sports, and occasional programs devoted to children's or educational shows, programs targeting minority audiences, public affairs programs, and different types of series or special programs. Local programming can be expensive to produce, and except in the case of news, may not easily attract audiences and advertisers. We've become accustomed to seeing certain quality, whether it be quality in terms of actors or storylines, quality of the filming itself. A lot of times local television stations may not have the types of equipment that the national folks do. And so those programs tend to suffer. The writing on those types of shows may also cause programs like that to suffer. So they don't attract as big of audiences compared to what you would see produced by national program distributors. As far as networks and programming, the increase in the number of networks over the years symbolizes the importance of distribution, economies of scale, and group ownership in delivering television programming. Because the costs of creating content are going up, and the fact that viewership on traditional media is going down, there has definitely been this trend in which the ability to have your production house and your network and various affiliates all co-owned by the same parent company has made things much more attractive for those in the media industry to do business and to do it more efficiently and effectively. The elimination of the financial interest and syndication rules are the big contributor that has allowed for all of that to happen. Prior to the modification of these rules, the networks were not allowed to own their own production companies. So that meant all of their programming had to come from somewhere outside of themselves. Nowadays, that is no longer the case. To reach a large enough audience, networks need an affiliate base capable of at least 90% or more of all TV households. As more TV households are acquired, the overall costs to produce and distribute programming thus decline because they're able to mitigate costs because it's all being done internally. Some network programming strategies. For those of you that have taken the broadcast programming class, many of these are going to be reviewed for you. There is the lead-in. The lead-in places the best program at the beginning of the primetime schedule in the hopes that the audience will remain for other programs. In the 80s, The Cosby Show was the number one program on television. It ran on Thursday nights on NBC at 8 p.m. And it was pretty much the catalyst for keeping people tuned into the NBC network for all of Thursday night because The Cosby Show was just that popular. Hammocking involves scheduling a new or week television program between two established programs at either the half-hour or the hour interval. So if you have a show that perhaps may not do as well on its own, it would be supplemented by two popular shows, one airing before that particular program and one airing immediately after. Tent pulling places a strong program between two new or weaker programs to generate more of an audience before and after the established program. So kind of like hammocking, but the other way around. You're putting the weight on one popular show in hopes that people will tune in earlier and stay tuned in later to catch the programs on either side. Counter-programming involves targeting a different audience from that of competitors. So if other networks are airing sitcoms during a particular time and day, you may decide as a network to instead air a drama or air news programming or something to that effect to try to attract a different audience. Stunting, most common during sweeps, involves a deviation from the regular schedule. This is where you may see various special broadcasts, either of established shows, or you may find various types of concert programming or special movies or things like that that are not part of the normal broadcast schedule but are billed as special events in hopes of attracting audiences. Blunting is where a network chooses to target a competitor by scheduling a program with the same demographic appeal. So It's not necessarily putting a drama against a drama, although that could happen. But if you have, say, a drama on one network that really goes into forensics, for example, like a show like CSI, a network may decide to air a show that features real law enforcement doing real forensics as a way to try to attract the people that would normally watch CSI and steal that audience and have them come over to their programming. Seamlessness provides a commercial-free transition between the end of one program and the beginning of another in hopes to maximize audience flow and ultimately increase ratings. Most networks are doing this as a strategy nowadays so that there is no commercial break between the end of program A and the start of program B, so that people just get sucked in and go straight into the next program. Some of these tactics don't matter much anymore, however. Broadcast networks are increasingly making their programs available online, and many of these networks will make them available the day after they air on television. So there's much more of an emphasis of trying to get people to watch the show, no matter how they watch it or when they watch it, just as long as they watch it. But when we're talking about traditional television, whether it's broadcast or cable, a lot of these strategies are used in hopes that people will put the remote down and stay tuned in to that particular channel. Some other network day parts to consider: daytime programming, for the most part, is much cheaper to produce than that of prime time and is important in building audience flow throughout the broadcast day. Some of the day parts in particular and some of the things that those day parts emphasize. Well, in the early morning, you have your national news and information shows. That would be your Good Morning America, your Today Show, and the show that's now called CBS Mornings, used to be called CBS This Morning. Basically the national news and kind of talk types of programming that's available between 7 and 9 a.m. Many Fox stations will counter-program the national talk shows with local news. Daytime, between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., this time period features three main types of programming: various talk shows. A lot of those are syndicated talk shows. Also game shows and soap operas. Most of these target female viewers. They also target retirees, and they target the unemployed, or those that work second and third shift. So basically those that are at home to watch television. Late night programming consists largely of comedy talk shows, and they fight for younger audiences between ages 18 and 35. This is The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon versus The Late Show with Stephen Colbert versus Jimmy Kimmel Live. Overnights, these day parts consist of additional late night talk programs and various types of news programming. You'll see repeats of the local broadcast news or a loop of the national newscasts. On the weekends, mornings have historically been devoted to children's programming, although NBC was the first to adopt a different strategy several years ago with a push toward programming for young teens. This is where many of the television stations nowadays, mostly on Saturday mornings, sometimes on Sunday mornings, will air what's called educational and informational programming. And that's programming that the FCC requires that stations run on a regular basis. Afternoons usually consist of seasonal sports or sports magazine programs. The news departments for the networks will carry a number of public affairs and discussion programs on Sunday mornings, and then sports dominate the afternoons on Sundays. As far as local affiliates, how they fill the broadcast day when the networks don't, well, in the early morning hours between 5 and 7 a.m., you have local news or children's programming, or sometimes various paid religious programming. Mornings from 9 to 10, you'll see syndicated talk or a local talk show. Local news in the noontime hour. And then early fringe between 4 and 8 p.m., you'll see a combination of different things. Usually the early part of that time is going to be local afternoon news, or you might see various types of talk shows that would typically run during daytime hours. You might also find either a first run or an off-network syndicated show. And then in prime access, that's where you find a lot of game shows, court programs, entertainment news like Entertainment Tonight or Inside Edition, and perhaps other talk shows. Late fringe is usually set aside for the late local news in that 11 o'clock time slot. Overnights, you may find syndicated shows, repurposed newscasts, talk shows, movies, or infomercials. Overnights for most television stations are going to be kind of throwaway times, which the infomercials can actually create some revenue for the station. And there are some advertisers that are interested in those late night hours. So they're not complete throwaways in that regard. Weekends are set aside for movies, sitcoms, infomercials, locally produced programs, or various types of barter programs. And generally the strategy on weekends is that they're trying to fill network holes, especially on networks that will tend to air some sort of sports programming, and that sports programming may be sporadic depending on the sport, depending on restrictions that the various leagues put on the networks, and what games you can show in what markets and that sort of thing. Program managers work several months in advance to acquire programming and to provide enough time for proper promotion and marketing of new material. It is not uncommon for syndicators to start marketing shows to various local television affiliates as much as 3 years in advance of when they're looking for contracts to start. Independent programming and strategies. While the network provides many hours a day for programming, the independent with fewer financial resources must generate an entire schedule of programming. They've got to fill 24 hours a day. Most independents try to position themselves with a particular type of programming, or they may try to counter-program against network affiliates. We've talked at different times in different classes about the example of Channel 28 in the Raleigh market, where much of their daytime programming consists of various judge shows. And that's kind of what they've become known for. Some independent stations will build a schedule around a strategy known as stacking. This involves programming a block of time with the same genre. Again, Channel 28, the example there, with back-to-back-to-back-to-back judge shows. In large markets, an independent station will often attempt to secure local broadcast rights for professional baseball, basketball, or hockey games. Sports programming can be expensive, and it does carry risk. And the risk there is that what if your local team doesn't do well? Can you still keep a fan base interested to tuning in and watching the game? And can you also encourage advertisers to stick with you as you carry that game? Because you have to recoup those expenses. And, well, depending on what happens throughout the season, there could be significant success or significant trouble in that regard. Some independents also produce local news, although many stations have alternatively presented news in an earlier hour than other stations in the market. Many times the netlets or independent stations will either air a newscast at 10 o'clock in the evening as opposed to 11 o'clock, or they may air a 7 o'clock newscast instead of a 6 o'clock newscast, or they may partner with a larger station in the market to provide newscast services for them, as is the case with Channel 22 in Raleigh, which airs a version of Channel 11's news at 10 p.m. Opportunities through multicasting. Using digital compression technologies, TV stations in most markets now offer 2 to 3 channels of standard definition television to complement their main broadcast channel, which is usually in high definition. Some of the challenges here include distribution for those that receive their television not by antenna. It may be hard to get the .2 and .3 and .4 channels to show up on various cable and satellite platforms that serve your market, they are not required to show them. So there's a separate negotiation process that happens there to get those sub-channels to show up in addition to the main channel. Monetization, also an issue. Companies struggle with how to pay for these new services. Many times these services are not as popular as the main channel, partly because of the issue with cable and satellite carriage, but also because these various sub-channels tend to appeal to certain types of audiences, and those audiences are not going to be as big as the main channel's programming. And the audience itself, there's a possibility of cannibalizing your main channel and splintering your audience in such a way that neither service succeeds as well. So those are things that are considerations in offering those different channels, and there has to be various strategies as to how you make having those different offerings be viable for the station in terms of revenue coming in versus the expense going out versus the audiences that tune in to each of those services. This is a good place for us to take a break. We'll finish up the chapter over on part C of chapter 8.